Hi guys, in today's session, as it's almost Christmas holidays are over and a lot of you have got mock examinations coming up in January, I thought I'd do a little video on answering the exam questions and responding to command words. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to look at the different marked questions that you could get and give you a few tips and a bit of help about how you get those marks. And then I thought I'd spend a little bit of time looking at the AOs and how you respond to the AOs and how you get the marks, especially for these longer answers, which are kind of 8-mark answers. So let's jump right in and let's look at how you answer and get the marks for 2 and 3 mark questions, which are the shorter questions. Now, quite a lot of these are just describe or outline questions, maybe an explain as well. So for 2 marks, you're looking at making a point and giving me an explanation to that point. Point and explanation, which you're all very used to doing in lots of other subjects, that will get you 2 marks. I would also give you the little tip that if there are 2 or 3 lines in the exam for you to write in, if you're only writing 1 or 2 words, then you're not going to get 2 marks because the examiner will be expecting more than that. So also look at how much space that you've got to write in, and I'm not saying fill it completely, but you need to at least half fill it in order to get those marks, otherwise that's not going to happen. So 2 marks in a question is making a point and give me an explanation for it. Next are 3-mark questions, and 3-mark questions for Edexcel anyway are looking at, they say in the exam, point plus extended explanation. It used that term, extended explanation. So 2 and 3 markers are very similar, but for a 3-marker you'll be expected to give a little bit more detail, a little bit more explanation maybe, a little bit more detail in terms of your content, whatever that question's asking. So they're 2 and 3 marks. Now another way that you can get 2 or 3 marks are responding to sources or resources. So in geography, quite often you'll be given a table, a graph. They're the most common things that you're given in the exam. It could be a choropleth map, it could be some information, etc. Whatever it is, you must be sure that you use that data, because without using that resource, then you're not going to get those 2 or 3 marks. So if it's a 2-marker and it's resource based, you must give figures or give some details, and if it's a 3-marker, again you must give details as well. So that's the way that we get our 2 and 3 marks. Now the marks then jump to 4 marks, and quite often 4-mark questions are pretty straightforward. You'll be expected to give 2 points and 2 explanations. So it's very similar to a 2-marker, but it's probably on a topic, or it's probably on a question that you have to give a little bit more depth to your answer, or the process is a little bit more detailed, etc. So 2 points and 2 explanations. Again, look at the amount of space that you've got. You'll get 3 or 4 lines here, so make sure that you fill. Again, if you're only writing a couple of words or a couple of sentences, then you're not going to get those marks. So you need to be aware of other little ways that you can get those marks. So that leads us on to our 8-mark questions. Now 8 marks are quite common at the end of each topic. So at the end of the hazards topic, or the end of the development topic, or the cities topic, etc., you'll get an 8-mark question. And for 8 marks, it's broken up into 4 marks for AO2 and 4 marks for AO3. And I'll get on to what they are in a second. But if you only give content for AO2, if you're only given details on the content, then you won't really get above 4 marks, because 4 marks are given for this. You have to move into AO3. Now AO3, as we'll get onto in a minute, is about assessment. So the question will often ask you to assess or evaluate something, to look at whether something's working or not, to weigh up the pros and cons. And without that part of the answer, then you will not get full marks for that. Now it might seem that you're writing a little bit more for the content, which is kind of fine, but you must throughout, or at the end, and it's better throughout, you must be answering the question and assessing. The question will always be some kind of assessment or evaluation, where you may need to look at 2 sides to an argument, or 2 things or 2 places, and look at comparing them, etc. So that's the way that you will get those 8 marks in an 8-mark question. If you're just given content, then you're not going to get anywhere above 4 marks for that question. So you need to be really, really careful that you're making evaluative statements about the differences between the 2 things that you're looking at, whatever they are. It could be looking at whether an LEDC or an MEDC might have greater impacts in terms of if a hazard occurs there, or it could be, if it's human geography, you could be looking at top down or bottom up responses to development, and looking at which of those is better. So your content is going to be the detail about those two things, whether it's the hazards, hazard management, or whether it's the top down bottom up approaches to development, the two schemes. But you're getting the other 4 marks by evaluating or assessing which one is better, which one is more useful, etc. So that's our mark scheme, and how we respond to 2 to 8 marks. Now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time going over the AOs with you. Now AO1 comes into kind of 2 marker questions, and AO1 is describing, defining, outlining or stating quite often. They're the command words that are used within GCSE, A and B Edexcel. And that is really recalling content. So AO1 is just content. It's just the things that you've learnt, and you are basically regurgitating them and you're putting them down. It's literally just recall, really, AO1. And it's the things that you've learned, all the facts and figures and details and processes that you've learned on human and physical geography. So they're going to be only maybe 2, 3 and 4 mark questions, really. Now AO2, which comes into, it can come into 4 markers, but it most definitely comes in to 8 markers, is your understanding. So this is about explanation. So any question that talks about explanation, if you're explaining something, it's not just a case of stating a fact or a figure, you need to explain that process. So if you're talking about weathering, it might be a question on that you're not just going to state a process of weathering, because that would just be stating it. You have to explain that process. So that will be AO2. So it says here, explain how, suggest reasons or compare. Sometimes AO2, that comes into it as well. So that is for our 8 mark question, that is our content really. That is our explanation, etc. for our AO2 in our 8 marks. Now AO3, which is our other 4 marks and our 8 marker, this is what we call application. So really this is responding to the command words. And the 2 most common command words, which are very similar, but we look at how they differ slightly, are assess and evaluate. Okay, and assess and evaluate really is about you making an assessment, or you weighing up something, or you giving your idea of which is better or which is worse, or what are the pros and cons and which is the best one. So really the difference between AO1 and AO3 is AO1 is all the things that you've just learnt in terms of content and facts and figures, and AO3 is about applying that information and saying which is better or which is worse. So it's more about like you making a judgment really, AO3. So we've got assess, and if you get a question that talks about assess, then we know that assess means weigh up. So weigh up a statement, is it true or is it false? So that's what assess means, weighing something up. Now evaluate is very similar, but with evaluate you have to give a verdict at the end. So you have to provide evidence of agreement or disagreement, as you do with assess, but at the end you have to say which one maybe is better or worse. So going back to our 8 markers, if we get asked a question with assess or evaluate, then half of the marks are coming from the content, and a good half marks, even though it mightn't be as much as half of the answer, but half of the marks are coming from you making evaluative statements, you saying this is better or that's better and this is why. So you're basically kind of justifying your answer, your content essentially, and saying why one is better than the other. Now in geography, quite often when the examiners come to mark your answers, sometimes there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer, as long as you've justified it, and as long as you have weighed up both sides, and as long as you've made a valid judgment, and you've given a verdict. If it's evaluate, then you will get the marks. And the mark scheme, it rarely tells you which side that you're gonna, as an examiner, that you give marks for. It generally states that you give a balanced argument and then you give a verdict, or you weigh up both sides of the argument and you give your pros and cons, or you give your whether you feel the statement is true or false. So that's the important point. It's not as important to be right, because quite often both sides can be right. If you're looking at top down or bottom up strategies for development, then there are pros and cons on both sides. So the examiner won't be looking at which is right or wrong. The examiner will be looking at you, making sure that you've answered the question and you've given arguments for and against. And if it's evaluate, then you've given a verdict at the end of which you think is better. But again, it doesn't really matter which is better, because both, like I said, will have pros and cons. So hopefully you'll be able to use these tips and remember them in the exam, or watch this video just before the exam in January, and you'll be able to get better grades.